One of the most frustrating aspects of the whole creation-evolution debate is the fact that so much of the evidence presented in school textbooks, science journals, and consequently the secular news media is just partial evidence. People can be made to believe just about anything if they're only given part of the evidence, but when all of the evidence is presented, the truth has a funny way of coming out. Have you ever wondered why so many evolutionary scientists fight legally to stop school districts from debating the facts on evolution? Why all the legal battles to keep evolution from even being debated in the schools? The fact is that there are mountains of scientific evidence that supports creation and destroys evolutionary theory. One small example is something we call the micro-macro deception. And here's how it works. But first, let me examine the word evolution with you, if I could. In the literal sense, evolution actually isn't a bad word. It merely means change over time. I mean, we all change over time, so in the strictest literal sense, we do, quote, evolve. Our thinking even evolves as we get older. But that, of course, is not what the evolutionists mean when they tell us that humanity evolved from a common ancestor. And that's where the micro-macro evolution comes in. Now, you might be thinking, I thought evolution was evolution. I mean, most people don't even know that there are two different types of evolution, microevolution and macroevolution. So let me explain them to you. We'll start with microevolution. Microevolution is a common occurrence, and we see it all the time in living organisms. It's nothing more than a shuffling of current genetic information to adapt to a changing environmental condition. That's it. Creation scientists have no problem with microevolution. We see it all the time. For example, there was a study of cane toads in Australia that revealed over a span of 70 years the toads with longer legs tended to survive because they could run and leap farther and faster, thereby avoiding becoming some animal's lunch. Consequently, the shorter-legged toads eventually died out. All of the toads had it within their genetic structure to develop longer legs. So whenever the occasional toad would be born with a dominant longer leg gene, he would, of course, have an advantage over his brother toads who had shorter legs. He would tend to survive and then pass that dominant gene on to his tadpoles, and before you know it, the whole cane toad population micro-evolved longer legs. Now, again, there is nothing wrong with this as far as creation scientists go. We see this all the time, and this is perfectly acceptable. For example, if you put some dogs on an island where the climate was too cold for their fur, eventually you're going to have a dog born with a dominant gene for thicker fur, and he'll end up surviving, pass that gene on to his puppies, and over time you'll see that the dogs will have developed thicker fur, or micro-evolved thicker fur. It's the same thing that was observed in the Galapagos Islands with regards to Charles Darwin and his finches. Certain finches developed different shaped beaks over time that helped them adapt to the types of food that were available. In all of these cases, the finches, the toads, the dogs, the changes that they experienced were already built into their genetic codes. Now that's critical to remember. At no time did a single piece of new genetic additional information develop in any of these cases. It was merely a shuffling of existing genetic information. Now remember that. You'll see why in a little bit. This microevolution is fully accepted by creation scientists. It's always been seen as nothing more than an example of God's brilliance in creating all life forms with more genetic information that they use at any given time. This allows them to adapt to various environmental changes in order to survive. This is nothing more than a sign of a smart God. So now let's move on to macroevolution. Macroevolution is what's currently being taught as the explanation for the origins of humanity today. For those cane toads I talked about earlier to macro-evolve, they would have needed to evolve into a completely different species. So here's the dirty little secret that the evolutionists don't like talking about. Do you know that there is no evidence anywhere on the earth, nor have there ever been seen any evidences of any animal macroevolving into a completely different kind of animal? That's right, those finches on the Galapagos Island, they stayed finches. While their beaks changed shape, they were still finches. The toads with longer legs, they were still toads. They stayed toads. If the kind of evolution being taught to us now were true, those toads would have evolved into non-toads. maybe a bird, or possibly eventually a lizard, or maybe someday a cow. For this to happen, and here comes another dirty little secret, the evolving animal would have to produce offspring with new, additional genetic information. And remember, that has never been observed in the history of mankind. That's right, in all of the testing being done, in all of the laboratories and zoos by scientists worldwide, there has never once been an example of even one animal giving birth to offspring with new additional genetic information. There's only been a shuffling of existing genetic information, which is where you get the different shapes of beaks or legs or whatever, but the animals stay the same kind. So if the evolutionists are right, then we're forced to believe that for billions of years, life has evolved from amino acids and amoebas in the oceans and all the way up through the food chain, growing and increasing in complexity and design, adding new additional genetic information generation after generation in millions of species for millions of years. But suddenly today, it stops. Suddenly today that we have the modern technology, the laboratories, the scientists, and the cameras are rolling so we can observe it for ourselves, suddenly it just doesn't happen anymore. It really does take more faith to believe in evolution than creation. But what's so dishonest about the whole evolution debate and why we call it the micro-macro deception is that the evolutionists fill our textbooks and science journals with so-called examples of evolution occurring all the time, but if you read what the actual examples are, you see that all of them, 100% of them, are those earlier micro-evolution examples. That's right, 100% of all of the so-called proof of evolution occurring is nothing more than certain features on animals making slight changes in size or shape, but staying the very same kind of animal. You know, some dolphins may develop longer or shorter fins, but they have never grown wings and evolved into a bird. The evolutionists know this, and so they point to these genetic adaptations within a species and say, look, here's proof for evolution. Folks, it's the micro-macro deception. They're hoping that by showing you the way a horse can genetically develop different breeds of size and shape of horse, that you'll somehow take that as evidence that the horse used to be a whale. Remember, a dolphin developing longer fins is not in any way evidence that dolphins used to be at one time non-dolphins. So it is, in my opinion, very dishonest to use examples of commonly accepted microevolution as so-called evidence for the theory of evolution itself, or macroevolution. Now you may say, well, but it takes millions of years for those dogs to evolve into a cow. But remember this, it only takes one day for an animal to be born with new additional genetic information. And since that's a requirement for evolution to be true, and it supposedly has been happening through billions of years of evolution, we should today, if evolution is true, still see that happening every day. Yet of all of the millions upon millions of animals born worldwide, day after day, week after week, year after year, the percentage of current animals born with new additional genetic information is 0.0%. It has never happened once. It has never been observed.